Hi, everybody, and thanks a lot for your interest in our work. I'm Kristen Grant with Maine Sea Grant and University of Maine Cooperative Extension, and it's going to be my job to tell you about the EPIC 4+ year project, Collaboration to Increase Social Resilience in Midcoast Maine. And you're seeing here our long list of program team members who you'll get to know better at the end of the presentation, and if you join us for our local gathering on March 24th. All right, and the story starts in the with the place and the people in 8 communities in southern Midcoast Maine. Most of these communities are remote and rural and face unique challenges in response to climate change impacts. The communities here are particularly vulnerable to storms due to a combination of their geographic and social vulnerability. As you can see on the map, they are located on long, narrow peninsulas and islands where there's often only one access road. And also, the 8 communities straddle two political boundaries. So they have essentially two emergency management agencies and two planning districts covering these 8 communities. So the result is that's really complex coordination among all those organizations. So those are the physical and political conditions related to the place where these communities are located. Socially, there are demographic considerations for us to look at. We have an aging population, which includes in Maine a median age of 44.6 in Maine, and the median age in the US is only 38. We also have a high percentage of older residents living alone. About 46% of folks that are 65 plus live alone in Maine. We also have in this region high reliance on natural resource economies and high levels of self employment. And all of these combine to create a population that's higher risk when coastal hazards disrupt transportation and other types of infrastructure. So, those are the social factors related to the people in these communities. So these are the characteristics of the people and the place that make this region particularly vulnerable to storm impacts. Often in climate resilience planning, we look at the physical impacts of climate change and how to address them. But we look at them in isolation. So things like power outages and washed out roads and culverts, for example. But when we turn our focus to social vulnerability, instead we're looking at how those physical impacts pose risks to socially vulnerable community members. And in our case, we particularly wanted to focus on the ways that those members of our community are impacted differently by coastal hazards and to understand what makes some members of our community more at risk than others. So, like if you're looking at some of these pictures here, for example, in the case of the flooded road, we want to know who is it that's on the other side of that road and that's now accessible, and are they more in need of emergency response than maybe someone else is. Or we might also need to know who would be impacted by the loss of power in terms of their access to heat and food and maybe medical care. And in our case here, we're also looking at folks that are likely going to have their livelihoods impacted by climate impacts. So, what I'd like to do is just give you a definition then of social vulnerability. So, social vulnerability relates to the circumstances of a person or community that affect their capacity to anticipate, confront, repair, and recover from the effects of a disaster. All right, so now what we're looking at is a list of the social vulnerabilities that guided our work, and now we know that social vulnerability is the result of a combination of the physical impacts tied to the place and the social factors that are tied to the community. So these provided a context for our work. And these social vulnerabilities were developed from public data. So, from census block data that were made available through the Social Vulnerability Index, through the Maine Coastal Risk Explorer. And we can provide the URL to the Coastal Risk Explorer in addition. And so that's the sort of public data side. But what has been the most key element of developing these social vulnerabilities is that they've been adapted through the local knowledge of our community partners. And that was absolutely the key to success in being able to make some progress here. All right. So I wanted to expand on this concept of local knowledge being, at the center of the project. So, as you'll see, because I'm going to talk about our needs assessment here in a minute, um, that um, the needs assessment told us that in order to address the needs of socially vulnerable community members, we need to build collaborative capacity. And in order to build that capacity, we needed the knowledge and skills and resources of folks beyond emergency managers. So in our case, that meant emergency management plus social services, natural resource conservation organizations, and municipalities. Okay, so members from all four of those sectors joined us as representatives on our project as members of the advisory committee and also as participants in our project activities. So this is a sample here of the organizations from each sector, but by no means a complete list. All right, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about the various phases that we went through in the project to give you an overview. And so when we started our project in 2017, we began by gathering information that we, the project team members, thought was relevant to how to address the needs of socially vulnerable groups in the event of storm impacts. In our minds, that info was related to climate resilience planning documents at the local, regional, and state levels. And we discovered during our needs assessment that we were way off. We had hardly scratched the surface of the information that we actually needed. So now if I talk about our needs assessment phase, what we did is we held 4 meetings with 12 representatives from each of those 4 sectors. So basically they were like focus groups. And at each of those meetings, we asked a series of questions, and they were, in storm events, does your organization consider how to address the needs of vulnerable community members in its work in the region? And if so, how? What tools do you use? What are barriers, opportunities, gaps, and needs for coordination? So we got input from the members that participated in each of those 4 meetings with the 4 different sectors, and this is what we learned. Regional conversations about climate impacts and climate resilience were not happening, and there was very little communication between the sectors. There was interest and opportunity to share information and best practices across the region. Climate change presents different changes for island, peninsular, and rural communities versus semi-urban communities. Individual sectors were using different sources of information and different tools. And while each sector had protocols and tools and resources, there was no coordinated approach to providing support to socially vulnerable populations and individuals. So our major takeaway was that building connections between these 4 sectors in the region could be a very effective way to increase the social resilience and to support the needs of the people in those communities that are most at risk. Okay, so now I'll move on to our design and testing and retesting and testing again phase. So after several failed attempts, we finally got some funding. We got funding from the state in the form of a Maine Coastal Community grant program. We got private funding from the Island Institute, which is a Maine nonprofit. We got funding from Maine Sea Grant for student time, and we got institutional funding and support from Bowdoin College. And our quest was to design a scenario planning exercise, bringing together the representatives of those 4 different sectors to build connections that would better enable organizations to meet the needs of socially vulnerable community members in the event of a storm. And our quest coincided with COVID, creating all the complexities that I'm sure everybody is already aware of, so I will not detail them. Um, And our quest also involved inventing or at least radically adapting all of the tools and resources that we would need to accomplish our mission, because this task was so different than sort of your standard scenario planning exercise. So this design phase would have been completely impossible without the what I'll call the saint-like patience of the three Bowdoin students that worked with us: Julia Marks, Samara Nasser, and Casey Cunningham. They worked with the project team to provide examples and develop a scenario planning exercise framework, create a comprehensive community asset table, and also to build a regional story map. So we designed and tested and retested all of those tools and resources for months and months. All right, so moving on to the implementation phase. So, as you probably have experienced yourself, trying in the age of COVID to set a format or a date for an event like our scenario planning exercise was tricky, to say the least. But luckily, we decided in last fall that we would go virtual. And now that we're in the middle of Omicron, we're really glad that we did. Okay, and I'm actually making this recording on January 28th, and the scenario planning exercise actually happened on January 26th. So it's just held 2 days ago, and the data download from that event has really just begun. But I'm going to give you just a few quick stats. So we had hoped when we were designing the scenario that we would have 35 registrants for the event, and we ended up getting 47 registrants. 35 of those folks joined us for the pre-mating, and 41 joined us for the exercise itself. 100% of the folks that participated said the scenario that we used was realistic. 87% left the exercise with ideas for new partnerships that they were interested in pursuing. And we asked everyone for one immediate takeaway. And so I thought this one was particularly interesting. I thought one important takeaway was the overarching lens of social resilience. Here, hearing from the public works participants about how they simply do not have access to the type of information that we're talking about and are tasked with treating everyone the same was illuminating. It was refreshing to begin to thread this into the conversation. I appreciated how thoughtful and open everyone in my breakout group was. All right, and as I mentioned at the end of the presentation, we're going to get a quick introduction to all of our project team members here, which is just a group of people that have been amazing to work with. So Victoria Boundy from Casco Bay National Estuary Partnership, Annie Cox from Wells National Estuary and Research Reserve, Elizabeth Hertz from Blue Sky Planning Solutions, Jeremy Bell from the Nature Conservancy, Eileen Johnson from Bowdoin College and her three students, Julia Marks, Samara Nasser, and Casey Cunningham, Ruth Indrick from Kennebec Estuary Land Trust, and as I mentioned, I'm Kristen Grant with Maine Sea Grant and University of Maine Cooperative Extension. All right, and I just want to say thank you, and there's my contact information, and that we hope you'll be able to join our team on our regional gathering for Social Coast that's on March 24th, and we can talk with you more in detail then, and we'll definitely have many more insights to share at that point, as we'll have a couple of more months to do some data downloads, so thanks very much.